Hi class, welcome to lecture 3. Today we're going to be talking about nations and society. So to start, let's go ahead and define what a society is. I think we hear the term all the time, but we never really actually break it down or think of what it means to be part of a society. And it is a very broad term that is used to refer to very complex organizations. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint because it's ambiguity and broadness. But we're going to define it as a collection of people bound by shared institutions that define how human relations should be conducted. So it's a very wordy definition, essentially people bound by the same institutions and same norms, we might say. So, in American society, we all have the same institutions, same laws, the same consequences, and the same idea of how at least we should communicate with each other to a certain degree. And obviously there's discrepancies there, but that's how we're going to define society for the purposes of this class. So what we're going to do, keeping that in mind, that definition of society, is we're going to look for ways in which people identify themselves within a society. So how people identify themselves as both individuals and groups of people. And we're going to talk about 3 different ways: ethnicity, national identity, and more formally, citizenship. So let's go ahead and start with ethnicity. Ethnicity is institutions that bind people together through a common culture, including languages, common religions, locations, customs, appearances, history, basically the things that we consider make us part of a group of people. We could say traditions as well. So these similar languages, traditions, religions bind certain peoples together into what we call ethnicity. Now, don't make the mistake of confusing statehood or national identity, which we're going to talk about in a second, with ethnic identity. It is different. And in fact, you can have multiple ethnic identities in a single society, in a single nation even. An example I use here is in Singapore, there's ethnic Chinese people, there's ethnic Malays, Indians. You have multiple ethnicities operating in the same country, the same statehood. The next way people tend to group or organize themselves is by national identity. And this is what I was referring to before. This is the institutions that bind people together through, politically, let's say, political aspirations. In particular, the idea of self-sovereignty. We talked about self-sovereignty in our first lecture, I believe, and the idea that you have to be a sovereign state to truly be legitimate. And these institutions can bind us together in a way that we would say would be national identity. So national identity sometimes, and quite often actually, develops from ethnic identity, which we just spoke about. And I think the perfect example of that is Pakistan, right? Pakistan separated from India. So India was under British control for quite a long time. The British eventually gained their independence, but the ethnic Pakistani people, what we call them now, also wanted their own sovereign state. So they separated from India and create what is now called Pakistan. Okay, and perhaps because of those differences in ethnicity, Pakistan and India are pretty much constantly at odds, right? They're almost constantly, it seems like they're on the brink of war. So one thing that can evolve, or maybe even say devolve, from a strong sense of national identity, again, faith in the system, your unique political standing point, is nationalism. National identity can, in times, create nationalism. And nationalism is another term that we could have 30 definitions for. We're going to try to define it here: a pride in one's people and the belief in their own political sovereignty, and this is important, that is separate from those of others. So it's a pride in your own distinct type of political system, your own political sovereignty, or your own state, and you believe that you are truly different from other states. Oftentimes you think perhaps you're better than other states. That's what we define nationalism, a strong sense of nationalism, looking inward, saying, what can we do to make our country better? Maybe not necessarily at the expense of other countries, but certainly putting our country before them. So instead of something like a global identity, it's much more of a national identity. And, the term nationalism is used quite negatively today, and probably properly so. But the questions I ask for you guys, is nationalism necessarily always a bad thing? And I think that's something to think about, right? I think when we think of nationalism, we think of bad things because in the past, nationalism has led to bad things, a focus on often at the disregard of other peoples and states. People often point to people like Adolf Hitler being a nationalist, believing in the pride of Germany and Germany as a separate, unique country. So I think it often can lead to bad things. Others say, no, if you look at people like Gandhi or maybe even Abraham Lincoln, they were in some ways nationalist in that they focused inward. They believed in their own unique political sovereignty. So, it depends on how you use it, but normally today it is used with a rather negative connotation. Lastly, we have citizenship and my added patriotism as well. And I can't think of anything more patriotic than Ronald Reagan riding a velociraptor, shooting an automatic weapon. I thought that was a funny picture, so I added it in. But let's talk about patriotism and citizenship. Citizenship is your relationship to the state you live in, the government you live in, any individual's relationship to the state they live in. And as we discussed in our first lecture, in any type of government, it's a contract, right? It's some sort of social contract where you're trading your allegiance for certain rights, right? So you're giving up something as well. To kind of reiterate, in the United States, for example, we give up certain rights and freedoms. We can't do whatever we want. We can't go 150 on the freeway. We can't steal things. We can't, we pay taxes, right? We're giving up certain elements of our own freedom or liberties in protection for other liberties and rights and protection of property, et cetera. Okay, so that's really how I would define citizenship, our relationship to the state. Patriotism, on the other hand, and I want to distinguish this from nationalism, see if we can kind of point out the difference. Patriotism is simply pride in one's state, pride in one's nation. So, patriotism is something that I think maybe in the United States, you see it more evidently than any other country in the world, right? We have our flags everywhere. We have the Go USA chant. The United States is a very patriotic country, right? And patriotism doesn't always go in hand with national identity. Sometimes it does. A good example of patriotism being separated from national identity are countries that have national identity, but no state, right? Like Palestine. So Palestine has a sense of identity and an ethnicity even, but they have no state to be patriotic about, right? So if we had to separate the difference between patriotism and nationalism, nationalism is more wrapped up in the vision for the country, what you want the country to be, kind of working towards a goal of a certain particular point of view, and not necessarily how that state actually is. I mean, if you hear people talk about nationalism, it's always saying what we should do, right? We need to do this to make our country better. We need to do this to make our country more proficient or stronger, et cetera. Whereas patriotism is simply just pride in what our state is. And again, the terms are often different than what we see in real life. We tend to see nationalism lead to more individualism, I would say, more the idea of we're separate from you, and maybe we're usually we're kind of better. So nationalism does have that negative connotation, where patriotism is simply pride. So sometimes patriotism can bleed into nationalism, but they are, two separate things, two different definitions with a thin line between them, perhaps. Okay, so we talked about ethnicities. Sometimes, unfortunately, of course, we know the world can be a very violent place, and we know that ethnicity is, again, shared cultures, religions, traditions, languages, etc. Sometimes when you have multiple ethnicities in one state, it can lead to problems. And, students sometimes ask me, why do these multiple ethnicities living in the same space often have conflict. And, it's a hard question to answer, but a lot of it, I believe, comes down to human nature, right? For whatever reason, human beings, and we talked about human beings, how they seem to want to organize themselves into government. And that seems to be true. I mean, as far back as time, people are categorizing themselves as, a village or a country or whatever, dynasty, whatever it might be. I think the same thing is true of ethnicities. For whatever reason, human beings like to categorize each other. They like to identify each other. And human beings, with all our faults, often like to distinguish themselves from others and say that they're better. To put it simply, say that they're better than others. And ethnicity is no different. Ethnic conflict is very common. Civil war is very common in our world. So you often get these ethnic conflicts, essentially groups struggling for political power or perhaps economic goals, often at the expense of other ethnic groups. And of course, you can't really talk about ethnic conflict without, the Rwandan genocide. So I'm sure you're familiar with it at least a little bit. Essentially, you had two groups in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Rwanda had been colonized for a long time. And at the time, before the Civil War, before it gained independence, it was colonized by Belgium. And they separated people into two groups. And what's interesting, guys, about these different ethnicities is they're really the same people. The differences between the Hutus and the Tutsis, those two groups that fought against each other in the Rwandan genocide, were very arbitrary. I mean, they tried to claim there was differences like longer noses or longer necks or whatever it might be, but really there's no racial or difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis. So essentially the Tutsis had been in power when they were colonized, when they gained their independence. That left a lot of bad blood between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus were very upset with the Tutsis. So this genocide starts, and it ends up with around 1 million people. The numbers are hard to be accurate on because it was such a mess. It's hard to count, but most estimates say around 1 million people died in this genocide. Most being Tutsis, from that ethnic group, the Tutsis. Probably around 500,000 to 750,000 Tutsis were murdered in this genocide, and mostly with machetes. It was a terrible, terrible conflict. But it is, again, an example of ethnic conflict that goes on in this world, and I think we can tie this in directly with colonialism, which obviously is going to leave scars on a country. But ethnic conflict is a great evil. So the question I have for you, just think about, is how can ethnic conflict be avoided? When you have multiple ethnicities in one country or even in one area, how do you kind of bridge the gap between two groups, make sure that there's no bad blood? And it's a hard question. I don't expect you to be able to answer it necessarily, but I think it's worth thinking about how we can prevent something so terrible as the Rwandan genocide. Now, I have a short video. If you're not really familiar with the Rwandan genocide, give it a quick watch. Very interesting, very sad, but it's worth researching. Again, we can't learn from the past unless we acknowledge it. If you haven't seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, I strongly recommend you watch it. It's more interesting, this video I have here, obviously much longer. It's with Don Cheadle. And normally, if this were an in-person class, I would show it in class. But just a really chilling movie that shows many of the atrocities that happened during the Rwandan genocide. So kind of just a warning, guys, this video can be a little bit graphic and talks about murder and death and very terrible things. So not mandatory that you watch that, but if you're interested, I recommend that you do. Okay, so that's going to wrap up our very short section A of this lecture. I will post section B as soon as I'm done recording.